All right. Good evening, everybody. And actually, even though I put up the text to share, um, I I, I want to start with a little sort of digression, I guess, before that, and that is, the term tikkun olam, right? I mean, there's tikkun olam is a very popular phrase in the Jewish community. Um, it's relatively recent. I mean, I can't tell you precisely when I first started hearing it being used, but it certainly was not that long ago. And the phrase tikkun olam, so tikkun litaken means to fix or to repair. Olam means the world, so tikkun olam means fixing the world, right? And that's like, without getting into precisely how that's done, tikkun olam means fixing or repairing the world. Um, and, you know, recently, that within the last few decades, it has come to mean somehow, without putting too fine a point on it, liberal social action. Um, and let me make it very, very clear that I am very much in favor of liberal social action. And if you don't know that, then you don't know me. Um, and all of you know me. So this is not a for or against liberal social action, but that is not what the term meant originally, right? I mean, we have this phrase actually in the prayer book three times a day in the Alenu, right, which says litaken olam b'malchut shaddai, litaken, to repair the world, b'malchut shaddai, under God's sovereignty. Okay, um, but where does this term come from? Um, and the reason that I bring it up is because a lot of what the material that we looked at 2 weeks ago, that we're looking at tonight, or we will look at tonight if I ever shut up, um, really is about interpersonal behavior, right? Interpersonal behavior and how we treat others. And, one of the things that you may not notice, um, because we are Americans, we're pluralistic. We don't live in ghettoized communities, but the number of times it says to treat another person, to when you see another person, you should encourage other people to do this thing, and you should not do bad things to other people. And, I don't know if it jumped out at anybody else the way it jumped out at me. But particularly in like rabbinic texts, by which I mean post-biblical text, right? That's actually pretty rare. I would expect it not to say, treat your fellow human being in such and such a way, but treat your fellow Jew in such and such a way, because that's mostly what rabbinic texts would do. But here it's very humanistic and it's very pluralistic. Okay. But in Kabbalah, tikkun olam means, it's another word for releasing the sparks, right? Like we've seen this concept that there are sparks of divinity that are encapsulated in matter. And when we perform mitzvot, we release those sparks. Um, and when enough of those sparks have been released, and they're released to rejoin their source, and when enough of those sparks have been released, redemption will come. Okay, so tikkun olam certainly means redemption, but it doesn't mean redemption by, voting for the right bill or voting for the right candidate or collecting lots of cans for recycling, right? It's a much more like mystical thing than that. But what's becoming clear, at least through, the material that we've been looking at, is that yes, but those sparks are in fact like released in a way. It's certainly not like, the proper policy or recycling, but it is proper interpersonal behavior, right? And it is interpersonal behavior, not inter-Jewish behavior, right? We should treat all human beings in that way. Why? Because because we are dealing with the idea that human beings are created in the divine image, right? And we'll see that tonight, right? And it is very much human beings created in the divine image and not merely Jews created in the divine image, right? So I think that there is an interconnectedness, which I would not really have, I think, acknowledged before looking at this material, between the Kabbalistic idea of tikkun olam and the more contemporary progressive idea of tikkun olam. But having said that, the earliest source, I'm not saying that this is the earliest source for the phrase tikkun olam. It is the earliest source for the phrase tikkun olam with which I am familiar. Um, is in the Talmud dealing with the sabbatical year. Okay, or what is a sabbatical year? The sabbatical year, every seventh year, we were not allowed to farm, we were not allowed to plant, we were not allowed to sow, we were not allowed to harvest. But but particularly when you're dealing with trees, right? Fruit grows on its own in that year, whether you prune, whether you harvest, the fruit grows, right? And the law was that anybody had the right to come into the orchard and pick that fruit. Okay, anybody, and it was in essence a social welfare program, right? The poor people would come and they would pick fruit, they would glean, they would harvest, and they would be fed. All right, but the Talmud says that the farmer who has an orchard can put up a fence. Put up a fence, why? To control access, okay? And now, specifically to control access, not to prevent access, right? In other words, you could not put up a fence and say, okay, now nobody can come into my orchard. But you could put up a fence and say, look, 10 people a day can come into the orchard because if more than 10 people come into the orchard on any particular day, it'll destroy the orchard, right? Or, everybody wants to harvest the apples on the first day of the picking season. So everybody will come and we'll have a stampede and people will get hurt. So the farmer could control access but not prevent access. Why? mipnei tikkun olam. Okay, for the sake of tikkun olam. Okay, and now you might look at that and say, wait a second, I thought tikkun olam was a liberal and progressive idea, right? And here tikkun olam means something, you know, really pretty conservative. Okay. But I would say two things about that. One is that um, tikkun olam, in this sense, I think means not so much repairing the world as orderliness of the world, right? That chaos is not good for anybody, right? And that also, ideas, it's not enough for an idea to mean well. It has to actually be good policy that actually serves the goal for which it was enacted, right? So, I mean, this is not a class on macroeconomics, but Alan, with all due respect to your brother, um, I think the county's rent control law is a very bad law that means it means well, but the result has been the utter collapse of the construction of rental housing in the county, which doesn't help poor people. It just doesn't. I mean, and I think it absolutely means well, but it's not tikkun olam because tikkun olam is not. It's not enough to mean well. You actually have to do good things and have good results. And similarly, if you simply say everybody can come into the orchard whenever they want, and as a result the orchard is destroyed, you may mean well, but it doesn't really help anybody. So tikkun olam is not, I think, inherently progressive or not progressive so much as adopting policies that actually function to the benefit of society and not merely intended for the benefit of
Yeah. Rabbi,
society.
apparently you've been listening in on our luncheon conversations, but the issue on this, and I think on so much of this that are reading, is that there needs to be a balance, and that's the important thing. Find out what is your goal, and the goal in the 7 years, as I understand it, is to let the land rest for a while, and it's an environmental thing too. But what is your goal, and what's the best way to accomplish it within within all the competing spheres?
Right, right. I mean, you have to balance interests, right? And I think, if you lean too far in one direction or in the other direction, again, you can absolutely mean well, but policies are ultimately judged not merely by the intent of the policy, but by the effect of the policy.
Mhm.
Um, and and this, I think, is a problem. But I think it is inherently related. The issue of rent control is why I brought it up. Is inherently related to this same concept of allowing the farmer to control access, which may at first glance seem conservative and to prioritize the rights of the farmer over the rights of the poor person. But I think it doesn't actually, because if you have the right to harvest non-existent fruit because people have destroyed the orchard, you don't get fed. So it's just, so I wanted to discuss that because I do think that, this, that it, the idea of tikkun olam, which is so well known, but not really. I mean, just because you've heard of an idea doesn't mean that you necessarily really understand what it means. So let's go back to the text. Um, and here, all right. So talking about the heading for this is human and divine limbs. But it's talking about trying to understand the essence of God, right? So the true essence of God cannot be grasped by anyone but God. There is not a single angel in heaven who knows God's location, and certainly not God's true essence. Okay, and so I can tell you, as a rabbi, people will sometimes ask me, not infrequently, um, well, what does God think about this, that, or the other issue? Or to explain to me something about God, right? And if I understood God, I would be God, right? I mean, and my response to that is like, I can't, I have no idea what God thinks. I can tell you what the Jewish tradition says, okay? And we believe that the Jewish tradition is the best approximation we have of God's will, but to assert that this is absolutely, the tradition, which and the tradition itself is multivocal, but that if I told you I knew exactly what God wanted, um, I wouldn't be a genius. I'd be a charlatan. Um, and this text bears that out, right? The only being who can understand God is God, right? Human beings cannot understand God, right? It gets back to, a couple of weeks ago when we, you know, the, the analogy of, right, of the blind men and the elephant, right? I mean, each blind person, their description of the elephant was true. It wasn't false, but it was only partial, right? Um, and so we can only grasp God's essence in in part, right? But also, it's not only like what is God's like, but where is God, right? And the angels don't know where God is either. I mean, there's a statement um, in Rashi, um, Hu mikomo shel olam ve'ein olam mikomo shel o. God is the place of the universe. The universe is not the place of God, right? In other words, God does not occupy a particular space within the universe. God encompasses the entire universe, right? So everything is God. Everything is God. I think is a classic Kabbalistic idea, right? It's not pantheism, it's panentheism, right? That God is in everything, right? So that there's not a single angel in heaven who knows God's location, and certainly not God's true essence. Don't you realize what the angels say? Blessed be the presence of Adonai from his place, right? Um, Malachal. Baruch kavod Adonai mim komo, right? It's in the Kedusha, right? Blessed be the presence of Adonai from his place. What does that mean? Means the angels, right? Because that's attributed to the angels in Isaiah. In other words, wherever God's place may be, the angels don't know where God is, but wherever God is, God's presence should be blessed from that place. If the celestial creatures do not know, then how could earthly creatures ever know, right? The angels don't know what is the location of God. All the more so we have no ability to know where is the location of God, right? But then you say, but it tells us in the Torah all kinds of things about God, right? We have, like, for example, you know, when I forget which number plague, right? But during one of the early plagues, and the Egyptian magicians, the Egyptian wizards say, "Espa Elohim hu," right? It is the finger of God, right? And then in the Haggadah you get, this kind of numerical wordplay, right? That if that plague was the finger of God, um, then what happened at the Red Sea was the hand of God, and so on and so forth. And we have lots of descriptions, right? That the no when God says you can't see my face, but you can see my back, right? And so later sort of gonna say, well, what I mean, you can't see God's face or God's back because God doesn't have a face or uh, a back, right? Or Adam and Eve hide from God because God is walking in the Garden of Eden in the cool of the day, right? Does God walk, right? So this source is going to say all those descriptions that we read in the Torah of God's hand, foot, ear, eye, what do they mean? Know and believe that although those descriptions indicate God's true being, no creature can know or contemplate the essence of what is called hand, foot, ear, or the like. So, in other words, they are right. It's the difference between an indication and an actual, let's say, portrayal. Right. Though we are made in the divine image and likeness, do not imagine that the divine eye is actually in the form of an eye or the divine hand in the form of a hand. Rather, these are innermost aspects of the divine reality from which the fountain flows to all creatures through the divine decree. But the essence of the divine hand is not like the essence of the human hand, nor is their form the same. As it is written, to whom can I be compared? Okay, so any questions or comments on that? Right? I mean, again, it's dense, right? But it means when it talks about the hand of God, it's not literal, but it's not exactly metaphorical either, right? It's a description of the impact. I mean, if I think, for example, um, Adam Smith wrote about the invisible hand, right, guiding the development of the economy, right? Does it mean that there's an actual hand and it's actually invisible? No, of course not, right? But it is as if there was an invisible hand dictating these things, right? Or the long arm of the law, right?
Mhm.
Right? Does the law have an arm? Is it no? Right? I mean, but nobody beyond age 10 or so, when they hear the phrase "long arm of the law," think that it means like a literal arm, right? Um, but it acts as if the arm was reaching out and and grabbing you and like throwing you in jail, or even throw. It's not really throwing you either, right? So I mean, we have all of these metaphors around us constantly that we don't even think of them being as metaphors, just because they are around us so constantly, right? So I think that's what's being said here. It is the same type. It is the same type of metaphor, but the Kabbalistic authors would consider it, the highest form of heresy to imagine that God actually had, these body parts, right? Um, all right. Know and understand that there is no similarity in substance or structure between God and us, except for the intention of the forms of our organs and limbs, which are fashioned as symbols of hidden supernal realities, right? So, in other words, I think that means, right, that again, that there's no, when it talks about the hand of God, it means the effect. It doesn't mean that there's a literal hand, in the same way that I think most, and certainly contemporary theologians, but I think even before that, when God says to Moses, "You can't see my face, but you can see my back." Um, we don't imagine that God has either a face or a back, but that um, when we say you see God's back, you know that God was there only after God is no longer there. But then again, there is a metaphor too, right? But we see that, we know that God has acted only after God has acted, not before and not during, right? Okay. Um, the mind cannot know these realities directly, it can only be reminded of them. As when one writes Reuben, son of Jacob, the form of these letters is not the form, structure, and essence of the real Reuben, son of Jacob, but simply a mnemonic device. Reuben, son of Jacob, is a symbol of the particular entity called by that name, right? I mean, to me, I like that comparison, right? Your name is not you, right? But it's not you either, right? I mean, it it is a mnemonic device by which we know who is being referred to, right? I mean, I mean, that works better for Charles Arian than for Alan Katz, right? Because there's lots of Alan Katzes. I mean, I don't know how many, but there's probably several hundred Alan Katzes in the United States. To my knowledge, throughout human history, there have only been three people named Charles Arian. Um, Two of us alive today. One is me. One is a superintendent of a forest in Uganda. And then there was a Charles Arian who was a Coptic Christian born in Alexandria who emigrated to Montreal in the 1920s. Um, Okay, so but even so, my name is not me. It's just a way of knowing who is being talked about, right? So it's an accurate mnemonic device, but it's still a mnemonic device. It is not, it doesn't capture the reality of the person, of the person being talked about. Okay. Um, since God wanted to purify us, he created in the human body various organs and limbs, hidden and revealed symbols of the divine structure. If one succeeds in purifying a particular organ or limb, it becomes a throne for the sublime inner reality called by that name, eye, hand, or any other one. So, in other words, I think what this means is it's not that the Bible talks about the eye of God or the hand of God so that we human beings who have eyes and hands will understand the power of God being referred to, right? Because that would really be God created in the human image, right? And not the human being created in the divine image, right? We have eyes so that we can understand what is being meant when the Torah talks about the eye of God. We have hands so we can understand what is meant when the Torah talks about the hand of God, and so on and so forth, right? Because otherwise it would be the opposite. I mean, and you probably heard me say that, and I think it's true, right? That whether or not human beings were created in the image of God, we have a tendency to create God in our image, right? Which, gets back to what we looked at the beginning of this text, right? I mean, what do we know about God, right? Because miraculously, we all have gods who agree with us about everything. Okay? You know, I think this mitzvah is important and some other mitzvah not so important. So does God, right? I support this policy, but not this other policy. So does God, right? So that, I mean, the Jewish God is in favor of the availability of abortion and birth control. The Catholic God is opposed to those things, right? But, you know, Catholic God A thinks those are the most important things in the world. Catholic God B under Pope Leo says, yeah, those things are important. Not saying they're not important, but other things are more important, right? But we all, I think, we create God in our image, but that's precisely backwards, right? We are created in God's image, and we have these various body parts so that we can understand the biblical descriptions. Yeah, Alan.
Rabbi, in the notes to this section by Dr. Matt, they were talking about purifying a particular organ or limb. And he
Yeah.
says, by acting ethically and righteously, one can purify oneself and become a channel for the divine. The Sifrot manifests through the body and being of such a person. And he
Body
cross
and being of such a
references
person. Right.
an Islamic text. But he said,
Right.
God Most High has said, when I love a servant, I am the Lord, I am his ear, so that he hears by me, I am his eye, so that he's seen by me, I am his tongue, so that he speaks by me, and I am his hand, so that he takes by me. And I mean, I think, of course, this is all metaphor, but I think it's a very beautiful metaphor.
Right, sure. And it is. I mean, it's like, um, you know, um, Shlomo Carlebach, who himself has a problematic legacy, right? But he says, and he was a singer, right? He says that the role of the Jew is to be God's megaphone, right? To be God's megaphone. And if you and it's exactly this, right? Because the megaphone isn't the source of the sound, right? It's simply it transmits the sound, but the sound comes from elsewhere. The megaphone doesn't create the sound; it merely transmits it, right? And and the Jews are God's megaphone. Um, and there was HUC in New York. Well, no, it wasn't just HUC. It was like a number of the different an interfaith seminary group in New York, which had a soup kitchen, and it was called God's Love We Deliver. Right. So that again, that's exactly right. That we become like quite literally the hands, the voice of God in the world, right? And that yeah, and this Islamic hadith takes that to an extreme idea. Um, but so does Hasidism, right? For Hasidism, the Rebbe is also it is the Rebbe's voice is the voice of God, right? And not metaphorically, literally, right? But it's I'm going to say something that's a little bit dangerous, okay? Um, but when you delve into like contemporary theology, right? And so there is this idea there all right, there's this school of contemporary theology called scriptural reasoning. And there's this concept called the second naivete. Okay, what is the second naivete, right? So that originally, right, we think, and most of us, I think, at some point go through this if we've been raised in a religion, that the text is literally the word of God, right? I mean, did any of you not go through a period in your life when you thought that God wrote the Torah, right? I mean, probably everybody has at some point. And then you say, well, no, God didn't write it. It was inspired by God, but it was written down by human beings in different times and places, and sometimes they got it wrong, and da 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 da, right? And then you get to the second naivete, right, which says, yes, that is true, but our faith is based in this text that has been handed down to us, the origin of which doesn't really matter, right? Um, and so, you know, when all right, so let's date this back maybe to the 1950s, okay, when we first started having like Brotherhood Week in America, right? And uh, all religions are basically the same. And then, that's a very lovely idea. All religions are basically the same. And then you learn more about religions, saying, no, all religions are not really basically the same, right? But then you get to this like advanced level, and you're one, oh yeah, all religions really are basically the same, right? Um, and that um, certainly when you get into like the mystical traditions, um, the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic mystical traditions are very simple, right? I mean, Professor Matt brings a hadith, right? And I'm sure, I mean, I don't know enough about it, right? But you know, you give me an assignment and give me a week and give me, access to a good library, and I will create for you a mystical reader, not label any of the texts. And I say, tell me which of these texts is Islamic, which are Jewish, which are Christian. You couldn't do it, right? And so yeah, I mean, so Professor Matt is bringing this Islamic hadith to clarify a Kabbalistic text, right? Because the idea of literally, and again, I mean, and I agree with you, Alan, that it's all metaphor, right? But for some people, I said this a couple of weeks ago, right? That some people realize that their metaphors are metaphors, and other people do not realize that their metaphors are metaphors. But whether you realize that your metaphors are metaphors or not, they're still metaphors, as far as I'm concerned. Um, and where we get really into the area of danger is when people don't understand that their metaphors are metaphors, and therefore feel compelled to kill people who have different metaphors. um but anybody who's killing other people over these kind of issues, God's spirit is not in them, right? I mean, as Philip Roth wrote in the short story "The Conversion of the Jews." I don't know if anybody's familiar with that story, right? Where the young protagonist Ozzy says, "You should never hit anybody about God," right? And I agree, you should never hit anybody about God, right? And anybody who, if you're hitting somebody about God, then you don't know God, as far as I'm concerned.
But
Yeah.
wait a minute,
All
sir.
right.
I'm sorry, I'm going to cut you off.
Yeah.
But
Go ahead,
Rabbi,
Stu. Yeah.
at this point, aren't we really talking about the ethical convergence of the three religions you mentioned, and also Buddhism and Hinduism and any other, not the technique of the religion, but the ethical precepts of that religion. And I apologize, Sue, I cut you off.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you are. I mean, as long as you recognize that it's not just about ethics, it's about divinity. That ethics is the way we channel the divinity, right? And we have different views of divinity, but again, I mean, there is not a Jewish, a Muslim, a Christian, a Buddhist, a Hindu, a Taoist God. There's only God, right? And in fact, according to this, not only is there only God, there is nothing but God. There's nothing but God. Um, and so, we're talking about different ways of describing the same underlying reality, right? Which is in that sense where, yeah, all religions are basically the same, right? Because they're all describing the same reality, accurately or inaccurately. And I don't even know how you would know that. Yes, Sue.
I was just wondering, and I don't know if I'm wrong in this assumption or not, but do you think that the mysticism or the mystic traditions that in the three monotheistic religions, it seems like they all developed around the same time. And I'm wondering if they all developed around the same time and possibly in the area of Spain, which
Possibly.
possibly was very open to all three religions, that maybe there was like a lot of exchange of ideas and thoughts, and maybe that's why they're so similar.
Oh, I think absolutely. I mean, if you look at um I mean, some of the height of Christian mysticism, right? You're talking about uh Saint Teresa of Avila, um, you know, San Juan de la Cruz, Saint John of the Cross, et cetera, right? And I mean, the Kabbalah, the great works of the Zohar and the Lurianic Kabbalah after that were all written either in Spain or by Jews who had been exiled from Spain, or maybe one generation later who were still culturally Spanish, right? And I frankly know less about Islam, but I also think that, a lot of the great Islamic mysticism was developed in Muslim Spain as well. And it it would be astonishing to me, if these three strains of mysticism which resemble each other and arose, in roughly the same time and in the same place, were not somehow in contact with each other, right? And again, this is not, I mean, this material is new to me. Um, and but I mean, I know more about um, you know, early rabbinic, like Mishnaic and early Talmudic literature and the church fathers, right? Again, it's very, very clear to me that they're in dialogue. I mean, maybe not like literally in dialogue, in the same way that, you can plunge into a sugya in the Talmud and you have two rabbis arguing back and forth. And if you don't know very much, okay, well, that's interesting. But then, like, you decide, well, who are these two rabbis who were arguing with each other? And you discover that, one of them lived in Eretz Israel and one of them lived in Babylonia, and they lived 200 years apart. So they were not literally arguing with each other, right? It's a reconstructed argument, right? But, the ideas were in the air. So yes, absolutely. I think that, that this, they had to be, if not in literal dialogue, then, the ideas were in the air um, in Muslim Spain for sure, for sure. Right. And I think the Reconquista, um, really did the Reconquista did a number on the development of Jewish thought. Again, I know less about Catholic or Muslim thought. But yeah, for sure. All right. Proceed a little bit more. Um, all right. Imitate your creator. Then you will enter the mystery of the supernal form, the divine image in which you were created. If you resemble the divine in body but not in action, you distort the form. Okay, so, and of course, we all resemble the divine in body. We have no choice about that. But, right, it's not enough to, that our body reflect the divine. Our actions have to reflect the divine too. And if not, you distort the form. People will say of you, a lovely form whose deeds are ugly. For the essence of the divine image is action. What good is it if your anatomy corresponds to the supernal form while your actions do not resemble God's? So imitate the acts of Keter, the 13 qualities of compassion alluded to by the prophet Micah. Who is a God like you, delighting in love? You will again have compassion upon us. You will hurl all our sins into the depths of the sea, right? And this is also the main liturgical ladder around which the Tashlit service on Rosh Hashanah is constructed. You should desire the well-being of your fellow creature. Again, your fellow creature, not your fellow Jew. Eyeing his good fortune benevolently, let his honor be as precious to you as your own. For you and your fellow are one and the same, right? Not your fellow Jew, right? You and your fellow are one and the same, right? Because there is nothing but God. There is nothing but God, and therefore both I and my neighbor are little bits of the divine, right? I mean, which is why, for example, like, and I mean, it doesn't happen that much anymore, but if I'm having a discussion which turns into a disputation with a Christian, and I'll say, you know, well, of course Jesus was the Son of God. And then they'll get all excited. Oh, the rabbi believes Jesus was the Son of God. I say, yeah, of course Jesus was the Son of God. You're the Son of God. I'm the Son of God. Right? I mean, I don't believe that Jesus wasn't the Son of God, but I don't believe that Jesus was any more the Son of God than anybody else, right? But we are all, right, the image of God. And if you like have the metaphor that, right, that the universe is not the place of God, God is the place of the universe, right? Then when it says you and your fellow are one and the same, that is literally true, right? We are all part of the universe, which means that we're all part of God, right? Um, You and your fellow are one and the same. That is why we are commanded, love your neighbor as yourself, right? Because you can't, first of all, you can't love your neighbor if you don't love yourself, right? Because love your neighbor as yourself, not instead of yourself, right? But, the gloss on that, love your neighbor as yourself, because the whole phrase is love your neighbor as yourself. I am Adonai, right? And either because your neighbor is part of Adonai just as you are, or if you want to be a little bit less panentheistic, right? Your neighbor has the same relationship to Adonai as you are. You should desire what is right for your fellow, never denigrate him or wish for his disgrace. Just as God desires neither our disgrace nor our suffering, because of our close relationship with him, so you should not desire someone else's disgrace, suffering, or ruin. You should feel as bad for such suffering as if it were your own. Similarly, rejoice over another's good fortune as if you were basking in it. All right, there's too much. I mean, it doesn't pay to continue because we have to stop like in mid, not even in mid, if not mid sentence, at least mid paragraph. So, um, but thank you. I mean, I think this is great material, which I never would have um, had this, have come across if not for people clamoring for a course in Kabbalah, and I finally got tired of saying no. Um, so it's really it's been really it's been an enjoyable class, and thank you. And obviously, I'll see you all over the next couple of months, but the class we won't resume the class until after Shmini Atzeret Simchat Torah. So. Good night. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom.
Have a nice, relaxing July.
Thank you.